Welcome to using grids in design, or designing on grids being the title of this lecture. I have a quote from Josef Müller-Brockmann, which says, "The grid system is an aid, not a guarantee. It permits a number of possible uses, and each designer can look for a solution appropriate to his or her or their personal style. One must learn how to use the grid. It is an art that requires practice." So whenever you are designing, you would like to use grid-based design. So what is a grid-based design? They are harmonious and reliable systems for presenting information. Grids offer effective design approach for site layouts and assist in communicating sites or pages. If you're doing a print design, don't think this is just for website design. Main messages clearly to the end user. They created ordered hierarchies, proportional relationships, and clear visual paths for the eye to travel. So how do we start a grid? Whenever you're thinking, hey, I'm starting a new project, whether that be a single page design, a multi-page design, whether that's print or web, it's important to start out with a grid. And how do I get going with that? So you're going to want to design in a ratio. Ratios are the core of any well-designed grid system. Sometimes those ratios are rational, such as 1 to 2 or 2 to 3, or irrational, such as 1 to 1.414, which is the size of an A4 sheet of paper. I typically don't do something quite that difficult to figure out mathematically, but however, you can do it. The first part is about how to combine those ratios to create simple, balanced grids, which will help you create harmonious compositions. So, first thing, start with your blank canvas. How big is your output size? How big is the screen ratio, your paper size? How big is it going to be? And even when you're working in web, thinking about, well, how big is a typical desktop computer versus a laptop versus a tablet versus a phone? And then determine which ratio is going to work with your grid. Step 2 is subdivide those ratios. So if you said, I want to do a 1 to 2, I'm just going to divide everything in half or in thirds or in fifths. Start dividing that page by those ratios. So this is an example using A4 sheet of paper where they're simply dividing it into fourths. So we're splitting it in half, and then splitting, this is the 1.414, splitting it again and again and again. So taking that ratio and using it again and again to divide that sheet of paper, adding in your basic margins. But you don't have to do this ratio. If you said, I want to just divide everything in half, well, split it in half, horizontally and vertically, then split that in half again. Split these into half. Split it in half again. And then if you said, okay, I've got information and I'm working in my grid and maybe I'm doing, just dividing everything in half, then I have the proportional relationships where if I said, okay, this is entirely 1/2, but I want it kind of centered on that page. So maybe I have, I've got a quarter here and a quarter here. Well, how do I want my sidebar to be? Maybe then I get down to an 1/8 or a 1/16 here on either side, and I can divide this into 2. So this is proportionally equal. So if I divided this in half or like a quarter, this would be a quarter of the width of that. That gives me a framework. That gives me a visually interesting design. That's a proportional relationship. If I said everything is divided into halves, this is 1/4 of the width of this, which is half the width of the entire page. And you understand that that's an easy one to do, dividing everything into half or into thirds, which is what I typically recommend for a beginning designer. I've got that framework that I can get creative in how things lie on the page and where things lie on the page. If I start building those grids within my layout design, all of a sudden it's like, hey, I understand where to put my image. I've got images, I have text. This is an example of lines of text. Where are those going to go versus where am I going to put image? And now I have a harmonious, unified, clear relationship. Even as I flip page to page, things look like they go together. They look like they fit together. Now you don't have to use a symmetric grid. You can use an asymmetric grid. So you can construct things to go on diagonals. You can use even an organic grid where you start putting in organic lines, but you're not just randomly throwing shapes onto a page. There's a rhyme and a reason, which is why people can follow your design page to page and why things look unified, not just random or floating. So in this example, it's drawing a grid line from corner to corner and then back again. And now I see this kind of dynamic angle where maybe I will put text, maybe I will have a headline floating down or a color bar or color blocking that allows me to do something dynamic across a spread or across pages of a website. You can also use really nice proportional relationships like the golden ratio. If you'd like to look into golden ratio, all you have to do is hit Google and, hey, what is that golden rule? It's a little bit more complicated math, but it's quite lovely. So this content area is divided into 2 columns using that golden ratio with a dynamic grid. And that gives a really interesting balance of content versus white space on the page. It's very rational. Extending the lines out of the content area, this gives us a more complete grid. Now I've got a lot of places that maybe text goes here. However, maybe I want to put chapter titles up here or a page number down here. I know where to put them. My grid allows me to solve problems in that way, that if I start with a grid and I say, hey, where does this element go? Let me refer back to my grid, and then I will align with the grid and with the ratios that I'm already using and go, oh yes, this is where this is now going to go. It makes sense. It visually unifies very quickly in my design because I've started with a grid and with a ratio. So you can keep adding bisecting lines, keep dividing in a proportional relationship. Now you add content, including running heads, folios. There's a lot of construction ahead of time. Think about it as your building blocks to your page design. You wouldn't build a building without having girders first in order to place everything in. That's what your grid does for you. It's not something that is printed out on the page, but our eye can understand and logically follow when things go from page to page, spread to spread when you are using a grid. So 6 creative column techniques. Embrace disharmony. Step 1, disharmony is, of course, the opposite of harmony. A grid is a harmonious instrument. So the goal is to achieve balance, symmetry, and order. So why would you break a grid after you work so hard to do it? The answer is to add interest. Embrace some randomness, chaos, or discord to create a space for them to thrive within your design. So if you have an element that breaks out of the grid, that goes different, it's automatically going to become a focal point because it is the thing that is different. It is the anomaly in your design. So when you make a grid, you can break the grid and all of a sudden make something very interesting and different. Join for variety. So just because if you said I have a 3-column grid in here, that doesn't mean everything has to be in 3 columns. Sometimes you can join those together. I have 3 columns here. I've merged 2 of those columns into a wider column. So I now have a 2 and a 1 instead of 3. Merging rows and columns together can break apart that grid while still seeming harmonious. Rows can be used to break up the visual flows of a page. Each row can create a new opportunity for establishing new column areas with different sizes, numbers, and variety. It's possible to create pages on your site or areas of pages that are heavily horizontal, or join columns to form rows and add interesting areas to your layouts. Consider varying the number of columns and rows you create. So if you said I've got a 3x3 grid, well, maybe one page it's 3x3 and everything follows that, versus another page you merge 2 of those rows or 2 of those columns together. And now you have a 1 to, it is 2/3 and 1/3. Interesting. That becomes a little more interesting and difficult for it, but it looks harmonious with the rest of your pages. Utilize angles. It is possible to set an entire grid on an angle. You can draw a 3x3 grid and simply angle it. Angled grids add a lot of visual dynamics and movement. They're more unusual on the web, but they can help you stand out, because the web is more square-based. So this being an example of where they took that their grid and rotated it slightly. So you see those 3-column layout. That's pretty evident in the photos, in the text, in the footer. It's a 3-column layout, but they slightly rotated it. it becomes visually more interesting and less static. Escaping boundaries. One of the techniques in line with embracing some disorder is to break out of the boundaries you've established in your grid. Once you've established your order, find ways for elements to move outside of it, cross over lines, or set up and break out of the visual flow. Pull quotes are an example in design of an element that gives you the opportunity to break out of your established visual flow. So this pull quote isn't just randomly placed. It is thought through of where it's going to go. However, it does stand out. So as I'm looking, I can see that, hey, here's most important things with my headlines. And then I have an important chunk of information. It's set apart from the rest. It's breaking that grid, and it visually communicates, hey, I'm important, look at me. So maybe I look here, then here, then here. I've set up that visual flow for the viewer. Illustrating areas. Illustrations and the use of design elements allow for overlapping and breaking out of the structure you've created in your grid. They can be used to add some areas of creative disorder and counterbalance the rigidity of a grid. If you're dealing with a lot of information, you have a lot of content, you have a lot of words, you've got to think about, how do I make that interesting? Most people don't want to just see a wall of text when they open up a magazine, or when they're looking at an advertisement, or they're going to a website. If it's just this flood of text, a lot of people are going to stop reading. People want to be able to skim. They want to know what the important things are. They want to be able to quickly determine if this information is worth reading. So illustrating certain areas can allow you to point to different things. As cited, you've got a nice little Cupid guy who's pointing up to things like this, where it's like, hey, maybe I do want to, if part of your call to action is to subscribe to your YouTube channel, hey, look at that. That gives me that visual interest to look up here. These elements are pointing down where it's like, hey, while this is a cool illustration, it's also pointing to the name. It's pointing to the site, or to this, the start of my article. It's pointing to these links over here. Maybe you didn't notice that at first, but that's done with some amount of intention that says, hey, look here, and then look here. We've highlighted the important things for you to do. It counterbalances the fact that, hey, this is a 3-column grid. Again, here's 1, 2, and 3. And notice this relationship. This is about half. This is the other half. So this is about half, quarter, quarter. There is a grid behind this. There is that logical proportional relationship, but it's broken up in such a way that it does look interesting. It's not just, I'm going to put everything column, column, column. How do I make that interesting to look at? Grids can energize spaces. There are some basic design principles to consider when looking at energizing space in your grids. Concepts such as asymmetrical balance, proximity, and repetition are all helpful in creating energy. Rather than having mirror images on either side of the layout, asymmetrical balance involves objects of differing size, shape, tone, or placement. These objects are arranged so that despite their differences, they equalize the weight of the page. So these photos in this layout are not the same size. It's not just one photo, two photo, the same size, this photo, but they look balanced. Visually, this isn't heavier than this side. This looks like a balanced grid and arrangement, but I can see that this photo with this text looks a lot like this photo with this text in that same size and weight. They repeat each other into the corner. This photo is the same width as this. You can see that they're the same width. However, this one is half that height, but that balances it out. This photo mirrors this column of text. However, because this is text and this is a photo, they're not exactly repeated. That equalizes the weight. It's not all treated the same, they're not all sized the same, but it's logically ordered so that visually, like, hey, that looks really nice. It's interesting. It's not all the same, but it balances. If you break down what that designer did to say, okay, rather than just photo, 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 text, how can I arrange that in a way that looks really sharp and interesting and cool, that I want to move through and look at this photo and then read this text, and look at this photo and read this text, look at this and read this. It's presented in a much more interesting way than simply placing all same size photo and same size text upon a page. This is another example of using some of those things where, hey, I've got This is simply a 2-column grid, but it's set up in an interesting way. I have those illustrative elements, and then they're repeated. This is 2 columns. This again is 2 columns. You see how this goes across? This would be another 2 column, but it's broken up 1/4, 1/4. But this looks like it matches as you go through that website. Another example of an interesting dynamic grid, or if you said, okay, this is about 1/3, 2/3, 1/3. This probably is closer to 1/4, 1/2 and 1/4. But it's all lined up. It's organizing that information. It's not just randomly placed. It's mathematically thought through. How wide is it going to be in relationship with the other elements? Our human brain likes seeing proportional relationships. So oftentimes if you're struggling, you're like, I don't know why my design isn't looking quite right. Double check your grid. How wide is something in proximity with another thing? Can you tighten up that grid? Because it automatically will make those designs feel better. There's another example where I've got a 3-column grid, but it's used in it where I've merged it here, 1, 2, 3, but this becomes 2/3, 1/3, all the way across. Again, 2/3, 1/3. That's an interesting way to look at that site. It's not just image, column, 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 merging columns and adjusting as you go through, but